Today I will tell you about the night everything I believed about family collapsed with one message on a glowing screen. My daughter texted me, after I had already poured every dollar and every ounce of trust into the mansion they lived in. Her words were stripped of warmth, stripped of gratitude, stripped even of the smallest courtesy. She wrote, "You will not be joining us. My husband prefers family only. You are not living with us." That was it. No thank you. No sorry. No space for me. Just an erasure delivered in the cold rhythm of typed letters. I remember the moment clearly. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that usually feels safe, but that night it pressed against me like a weight. I had just placed fresh flowers in a vase on the table. I had roasted a chicken with rosemary, thinking I might share dinner with Victoria and her children. The smell of lavender drifted from the candle flickering by the window, the same scent my late husband loved. It was a night meant for comfort, not for exile. When the phone buzzed, I picked it up with a smile, expecting a simple update, or maybe even a thank you for all the arrangements I had handled. Instead, that message stared back at me. My breath caught, my chest tightened. I read it again, slower this time, hoping my eyes had deceived me. But the words did not change. I set the phone down on the table, but it seemed to burn through the polished wood. The words echoed in my mind. Family only. What does family mean, if not the woman who carried you, raised you, and built the very roof over your head? I looked around the room. The meal I had prepared no longer smelled inviting. The flowers lost their color. Even the candle's light seemed dimmer. Everything felt like a stage suddenly emptied, the audience gone, the performance canceled. I thought of Victoria as a little girl, her hand gripping mine so tightly on her first day of school. I thought of the birthday parties I stayed up all night planning, the scraped knees I kissed, the nights I spent awake while she slept peacefully in her room. Each memory was real, each sacrifice undeniable, yet here I was, erased with a sentence. The shame stung more than anger, shame that I had let myself believe love and sacrifice were enough to guarantee respect, shame that I had given so freely without ever demanding boundaries. And now, with one cold message, I was reminded that even a mother can be cast out from the very family she built. I sat at the head of the long dining table, the seat my husband once filled, and stared at the phone, still glowing. The words would not disappear. They pulsed like a wound. I whispered to myself, family only. And what am I then? The clock ticked on, steady and cruel. The candle melted lower, its flame unbothered by my heartbreak. I did not cry. Not yet. Instead, I felt a stillness settle over me, as though the world had paused to ask a question I could not yet answer. That night, I realized something. If one text message could erase me, then perhaps it was time for me to remember who I was before I was reduced to just someone else's wallet, someone else's afterthought. I stayed seated in silence, the mansion around me echoing with the life I had built and the void they had created. One truth had already been spoken, but I knew this story was only beginning. The morning light crept through the tall windows of the mansion, throwing streaks of gold across the marble floor. I had barely slept. The words from that message still hammered in my mind, but I refused to let them consume me. Instead, I braced myself. If they could dismiss me in silence, then I would face them in daylight. I walked into the grand living room, the same space I had furnished with my own hands, and found Victoria and Charles waiting. Their posture said everything before their mouths even opened. They were ready to erase me, not with a text this time, but with their voices. I stood in the doorway, steadying my breath. Victoria turned first. Her eyes slid away from mine, as if the act of looking at me might weaken her resolve. She spoke quietly, but with a finality that cut deeper than a scream. She said, "Mother, you had your time. Now I need my own family." Her words landed with the weight of betrayal. My time? Was love something that expired? Was motherhood a season that could be swept aside? Before I could respond, Charles's voice sliced through the room. He leaned back on the couch with a smirk that carried contempt. "This house is ours now," he said firmly. "She should step aside." His words weren't just cruel. They were calculated. He wanted me to hear them, to believe them, to shrink beneath them. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is about to discard, confident that I no longer had value. For a moment, silence stretched between us. My chest rose and fell, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stared at them both, my daughter, whose face once lit up with joy when she ran to me, and her husband, who now wore the confidence of someone convinced he had won. They sat in the house I bought, on the couch I chose, surrounded by the walls my sacrifice built, and they dared to declare it theirs. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask Victoria how she could forget who paid for the roof above her head, how she could erase the years of care, the years of sacrifice. But my voice caught. Anger was boiling, but another feeling cut deeper. It was disbelief. This mansion, worth $22 million, stood because of me. Every polished tile, every chandelier, every inch of this estate had been secured by my hand. And now they sat there, looking me in the eye, claiming ownership, like thieves dressed in silk. Victoria shifted uneasily, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She avoided me, as though if she didn't meet my eyes, she wouldn't have to see the hurt she caused. Charles, on the other hand, leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're not needed here. This house represents our family now. You don't belong in it anymore." My fingers dug into my palms. I felt the sting of my own nails pressing against my skin. Every word they spoke was a blade, cutting not just into me, but into the very bond I thought was unbreakable. I forced myself to stand tall, though my heart trembled. I looked at Victoria and said softly, "And where does that leave me? Am I not your mother?" She swallowed hard, her lips pressed into a thin line. She whispered, almost as though ashamed, "You'll always be my mother, but things are different now. Charles needs space. The children need structure. It's simpler this way." Simpler. The word was bitter in my ears. Simpler for them to erase me. Simpler for them to enjoy the fruits of my labor without acknowledging who planted the tree. Charles didn't flinch. He spoke over her, his tone sharp. "You're holding us back. We need to move forward. And this house is the symbol of our future, not your past." I stepped deeper into the room, my heels echoing against the floor. My voice finally broke free, steady and clear. I said, "This house is not your future. It was never yours to claim." Charles scoffed, his eyes narrowing. He leaned back, crossing his arms with a sneer. "Maybe not on paper, but everyone sees it as ours now. And that's what matters." His arrogance filled the space like smoke. I turned my eyes to Victoria. I searched her face for a flicker of the girl I once knew, the daughter who once clung to my hand. But what I found instead was hesitation. Hesitation that still bent toward him. The room was heavy with betrayal, and yet I did not collapse under it. Something inside me shifted. Their cruelty no longer stunned me. It ignited me. I understood in that moment that I was no longer just a mother left out. I was the owner, the builder, the one with power they thought I had forgotten. I inhaled slowly, letting silence hang just long enough to make them uneasy. My eyes locked on Charles, and I saw the faintest flicker of doubt cross his expression. He expected tears. He expected me to beg. He expected surrender. What he did not expect was my stillness, my refusal to crumble. The air in the mansion grew tense. I could almost hear the ticking of the clock in the hall. They wanted me gone. They wanted me erased. But their declaration, as cruel as it was, had awakened something fierce inside me. I looked at them both, my daughter and her husband, and though my voice was quiet, it was laced with steel. You may believe you can rewrite history with your words, but history is written in deeds, and the deed to this house bears only one name: mine. Their eyes flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. Doubt. Fear. The smallest crack in their facade. They had spoken with cruelty, but cruelty is fragile when it meets truth. I turned then, leaving the living room in silence, but with every step I knew the war had already begun. They thought they had declared victory, but what they did not understand was this: that morning was not their triumph. It was my awakening. The mansion was quiet again when Victoria came into my study, her laptop tucked under her arm. Her voice was light, almost casual, but I noticed the tension hidden underneath. She said, "Mom, can you help me check my email? The attachments won't open, and Charles needs me to send them quickly." She handed me the computer as if it were nothing, as if she could trust me to fix it without suspecting what was inside. I took the laptop, my hand steady though my heart still carried the sting of what had been said the morning before. I clicked through the inbox, the folders neat and organized. Then I saw it. A draft email that had not been sent yet. Its subject line was simple: "Next steps." My eyes caught on the first line of text, and a chill raced through me. Listing price for mansion. Preliminary estimate, $21.5 million. Schedule care facility meeting for mom. Urgent, before fall. My breath caught in my throat. I scrolled slowly, reading each line as if it were a blade pressed against my skin. They weren't just excluding me from their family. They weren't just claiming the mansion as theirs. They were preparing to sell the very house I had secured and ship me off to a care facility like an unwanted package. The words blurred for a moment, not because I was weak, but because rage burned hot in my eyes. I forced myself to read it again, line by line, to be sure. Yes, there it was, in their own words. They were treating me not as a mother, not even as a person, but as an obstacle to be moved. Victoria stood behind me, waiting. She asked, "Did you find it?" Her tone was calm, but there was a flicker in her voice that told me she didn't realize what I had opened. I closed the draft quickly and looked back at her. My voice was steady. "It seems fine now. I'll forward the attachments for you." She smiled, relieved, and left the study. I sat there, staring at the screen long after she was gone. My pulse thundered in my ears. Their plan was no longer suspicion. It was written, typed, organized. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, calculated, cruel. I thought of Charles's smug declaration from the morning before. "This house is ours now." I should have known his arrogance was rooted in more than words. He had already drawn up numbers, already calculated profits. He wanted to flip my sacrifice into his empire, and he wanted to erase me to do it. I stood and paced the room. The shelves of books seemed to close in, the air thick. A lifetime of effort was being reduced to a line item in their spreadsheet. I pressed my hand against the desk to steady myself, then whispered aloud, "So this is who you are." My mind sharpened. I replayed every interaction over the past year. The sudden push to host holidays at Victoria's house instead of mine. The way Charles made small comments about renovations, as if preparing to sell. The avoidance of including me in family photos. Every omission now fit together, like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see. I remembered Thanksgiving when they posed for pictures in matching sweaters. I had been handed a blue one while they all wore red. I told myself then it was nothing. But it was never nothing. It was practice, a slow rehearsal for erasing me completely. The anger inside me hardened into resolve. They wanted me gone. They wanted to treat me as disposable. But they had forgotten who built the foundation under their feet. They had forgotten that no sale, no transaction, no meeting with a so-called care facility could proceed without the one name that still controlled it all. Mine. The irony cut deep. They had asked me to check an email, trusting that I would never look too closely, trusting that I would remain blind, passive, docile. They underestimated me, as people so often do when they confuse kindness with weakness. That mistake would cost them more than they could imagine. I closed the laptop gently, my reflection staring back at me from the dark screen. I saw a woman who had been dismissed, betrayed, and plotted against. But I also saw a woman who still held power, a woman who would not be discarded like furniture or hidden away in a facility. Later that afternoon, I passed Victoria in the hallway. She smiled politely, the way one does when they believe a secret is safe. She said, "Thanks for fixing the email, Mom." Charles was getting anxious. I nodded, hiding the steel in my eyes. "Of course, darling, always happy to help." Inside, though, I was no longer the same. Their mask of civility had slipped, and I had seen the machinery beneath it. They were planning my exile. But instead of fear, I felt clarity. I knew the shape of their betrayal now, and I knew the battleground on which we would meet. That night, alone in my room, I laid out the truth on paper. I wrote down the figures, the care facility note, the listing price. I folded the paper neatly and placed it in my drawer. Evidence, a reminder, and a promise to myself. I whispered to the darkness, "You think you can sell this house. You think you can erase me. But you forget. The ink on that deed is mine. The accounts you draw from are mine. And soon you will learn that betrayal has a cost." The mansion was still. The candle on my nightstand flickered, and as I closed my eyes, I did not feel despair. I felt the steady rise of a storm within me, one that would no longer be ignored, because now I knew. They hadn't just crossed a line. They had built a future on my erasure, and I would not let that future stand. I did not hear their conversation directly, but walls in a mansion do not always keep secrets, and voices raised in tension have a way of carrying down long hallways. That night, as I moved past the closed door of Victoria's bedroom, I caught the sharp edge of Charles's voice. It was not meant for me, but every word reached me like the crack of a whip. He said, "She will ruin our image. We cannot let her stay. Do you want this life or not?" His tone was cold, decisive, the voice of a man who believed appearances were worth more than blood. I stopped in my tracks. My heart tightened. Through the door, I could hear Victoria's muffled sobs. She tried to answer, her voice breaking. But Charles pressed harder, his words relentless. "You know what people think when they see her here? Old, weak, out of place. We are building a reputation. We are creating something bigger than her. If you want this life, if you want what I promised you, then you have to choose." I leaned against the wall, every nerve in my body alert. My daughter's voice trembled as she whispered, "She is still my mother." The words sounded fragile, almost apologetic. Charles did not soften. He shot back, "And she had her time. Now she is a shadow clinging to what no longer belongs to her. You said you wanted a future. Then stop looking backward." There was silence for a moment, broken only by Victoria's faint crying. I could picture her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the sheets, torn between the man she chose and the mother who raised her. And then I heard it, the sound that made my stomach twist, a quiet sob, followed by her broken whisper. "You are right. She cannot stay." The agreement was spoken, sealed with her weakness. My daughter had chosen him, not me, not the years of sacrifice, not the foundation of love. She chose the illusion of a perfect life Charles dangled before her. I pressed my hand to the wall, my nails digging into the paint. The conversation had confirmed everything I already knew from that draft email. They were not simply careless or misguided. They were deliberate. They saw me as an imperfection, something that spoiled their carefully crafted picture of success. Charles continued, his tone triumphant. "Good. That is the answer I needed. We will make the arrangements. The house will sell quickly. With the right listing price, we will be free." He paused, lowering his voice into something sharp and personal. "You want to be admired, Victoria. You want people to look at us and see power, elegance, control. That means no loose ends, and your mother is a loose end." His words struck harder than any insult ever could. A loose end. That was what I had become in their eyes. Not a woman. Not a mother, not the very person who had secured the mansion they lived in, just a thread to be cut so their image would look seamless. Victoria's crying slowed. She sniffled, then whispered, "I do not want her to suffer." Charles laughed, low and bitter. "Suffer? She has lived her life. She has had her time in the light. Now it is our turn. We will give her a place, a facility where she can be taken care of. That is enough. And when the house is sold, when the money is in our hands, we will finally be free of her shadow." I clenched my fists, the fury rising like fire in my veins. I did not step into the room. I did not confront them then. But inside me, something shifted forever. The veil had been torn away. Charles was not just arrogant, he was ruthless, obsessed with appearances, willing to discard me like an inconvenient detail. And Victoria, my daughter, was too blinded by his promises of status to see the cruelty for what it was. I walked back to my room in silence, but every step felt heavier, harder, filled with resolve. The betrayal had a voice now. It was no longer hidden behind polite smiles or vague excuses. It had been spoken aloud, raw and undeniable, and that truth gave me strength. Sitting at my desk, I looked around the mansion. The chandeliers above, the art on the walls, the polished floors. They thought all of it belonged to them. They thought by erasing me they could perfect their image, that the world would believe the mansion was theirs alone. But they had underestimated me again. I whispered to myself, if he thinks I am a loose end, he has forgotten who holds the thread. That night, I did not cry. I did not tremble. I planned. Their cruelty had unmasked them completely, and I no longer saw Victoria as the child I raised or Charles as the husband she chose. I saw them both as adversaries, blinded by vanity, walking straight into the fall they were designing for me. What they did not understand was this: I had spent a lifetime navigating storms far worse than their shallow cruelty, and if they believed they could reduce me to silence, then they had already lost. I closed my eyes, the echo of Charles's words still ringing in my ears. She will ruin our image. We cannot let her stay. You want this life, do not you? My daughter's tearful agreement followed close behind. The words would never leave me, but instead of breaking me, they built the fire I needed. And as the house fell into silence again, I knew the time for quiet endurance had ended. The next move would be mine. The morning after I heard Charles's words through the walls, I knew I needed to step away from the mansion. My thoughts were sharp, but my chest felt heavy. If I stayed in those halls too long, surrounded by betrayal, I risked drowning in their cruelty. So I drove to the edge of town, to a quiet brick house with ivy creeping along its porch. It belonged to Margaret Doyle, my dearest friend. Margaret was 65, widowed like me, and carried the same kind of quiet strength forged through years of struggle. She opened the door before I even knocked, her gray eyes narrowing at the sight of me. "Eleanor," she said softly, "what happened?" I stepped inside, the warmth of her home wrapping around me like a quilt. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the old wooden clock ticked steadily on her wall. I sat at her kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly, and for the first time since the message, since the confrontation, since the overheard betrayal, I let my voice break. I told her everything. The text that dismissed me from my own daughter's life, the cruel declaration in the living room, the email draft that listed the mansion like a commodity and planned a care facility for me. And then, the words through the door, Charles demanding perfection, Victoria surrendering to him with tears in her eyes. Margaret listened without interrupting. She did not gasp. She did not pity me. She let me speak until my words ran out, until silence hung heavy between us. Then she leaned back, her hands folded on the table, and spoke with the kind of clarity only a true friend can give. Family isn't who takes your house, Eleanor. Family is who remembers who built it. Her words landed like a strike of lightning. I stared at her, the weight of her truth settling deep in my bones. She leaned forward, her voice firm. They think they can erase you because they've confused your silence with surrender. But I know you. You've built too much, sacrificed too much to be treated as if you're disposable. If they want war, then don't give them your tears. Give them your mind. I swallowed hard, the fire in me rising again. Margaret reached out, her hand resting on mine. "Eleanor," she said, "don't let them write you out of the story you created. You are not a guest in that house. You are the architect of it." Her words peeled away the shame I had been carrying. I realized that I had allowed myself to stand in the shadows, hoping gratitude would speak for itself, but gratitude had never been their language. Greed was, and greed must be met not with pleading, but with power. I whispered, They're planning to sell the mansion, Margaret. They've already written down a price, and they want to put me in a facility, like I'm just an old burden to be shuffled away. Her eyes sharpened. Then stop waiting for them to show their hand. Show yours first. Her conviction cut through my hesitation. For days, I had been reeling, trying to make sense of the cruelty. But Margaret's words reminded me that cruelty thrives only when the victim stays silent. If I wanted dignity, if I wanted justice, I had to move. I sat up straighter, my voice steady now. You're right. I have all the leverage, the deed, the accounts. Every dollar that flows through their lives comes from me. They act as if I am powerless, but I am the foundation they're standing on. Margaret nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. Then remind them. But do it in a way they never see coming. The resolve crystallized inside me. I was no longer the woman sitting alone at a dining table with a cold roast and fading flowers. I was no longer the mother whispering to an empty room, wondering what family meant. I was a woman who had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed, and that gave me the greatest advantage. Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table to me. She lifted hers in a small toast. To remembering who we are, she said. I raised mine, my hand no longer trembling. To reminding them who I am. We drank in silence, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was full of purpose. When I left her house that afternoon, the sky was overcast, clouds rolling in from the horizon. The storm above matched the storm inside me, but I felt no fear. For the first time since the message, I felt something else entirely. Readiness. As I drove back toward the mansion, the words Margaret had spoken repeated in my mind like a mantra. Family isn't who takes your house. It's who remembers who built it. They had forgotten, and I would make sure they remembered. That day marked the shift. I was no longer the victim of their betrayal. I was preparing, calculating, waiting for the exact moment to turn their cruelty back on them. And this time, I would not whisper my place in this family. I would carve it into the walls they were so eager to sell. The betrayal in my own house had lit a fire inside me, but fire alone was not enough. If I was going to end this, I needed more than rage. I needed proof, leverage, and the law on my side. That morning, I drove downtown to the office of Martin Feldman, my attorney of 30 years. He had handled my husband's estate after his passing, and he knew every line of every document I had ever signed. If anyone could remind me exactly what cards I was holding, it was him. Martin's office was tucked in a high-rise on Wilshire Boulevard with glass walls that looked out over the city. He greeted me with the same steady handshake he always had, though his brows furrowed when he saw my face. "Eleanor," he said, "what brings you here so early?" I sat down across from his mahogany desk and let the words spill, sharper now than when I'd spoken to Margaret. I told him about the text message, the living room confrontation, the email draft listing my mansion like a property on the open market, the whispered plan to put me away in a care facility. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he folded his hands together and said quietly, "I had a feeling this might happen." He opened a file drawer behind him and pulled out a thick folder stamped with my name. He laid it on the desk, flipping through the pages with precision. Then he stopped and pushed a document toward me. "Read this." My eyes scanned the title deed. There it was, black and white, without question. The mansion was in my name alone. I was not a co-owner. I was not a guarantor for someone else's dream. I was the sole legal owner of the property. Charles and Victoria were listed only as authorized residents, guests with permission, nothing more. The words burned into my vision. For all their arrogance, for all their declarations, they were living under my roof by my grace. If I pulled that permission, they had no claim, no ground, no home. Martin continued, his voice calm but firm. "They can talk as much as they want, Eleanor. They can play house and pretend it's theirs, but legally, they have no power, not a scrap." I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The weight on my chest began to shift. For days I had felt cornered, powerless in my own house. But now I saw clearly. Their empire was built on sand, and I held the tide. Martin flipped to another section of the file. He tapped a page with his pen. Do you see this? Their business line of credit, the one Charles has been using to fund his projects. It exists only because of your guarantee. Without you, the banks pull everything. My eyes widened. Are you telling me that if I withdraw, their credit vanishes? He nodded. Vanishes overnight. No safety net, no funding, no house of cards left standing. If you pull out, their whole empire crumbles. The words struck like thunder. The mansion was one card, their finances were another, both held together by my signature, my trust. They had been plotting to erase me while building their lives entirely on what I had given them. I pressed my hands against the table, steadying myself. They thought they were in control. They thought they were already writing me out. But they had forgotten the ink was mine. Martin's eyes softened. Eleanor, you have every legal right to act, but you need to be careful. People like Charles, people obsessed with control, they don't handle losing well. I met his gaze, my voice firm. I'm not afraid of him anymore. He's been playing at power, but all along it was borrowed, and now I know exactly how to take it back. Martin leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. Then this is your choice. You can let them continue to dig their hole, or you can pull the ground from beneath them. Either way, you hold the cards. I gathered the papers, sliding them into a folder of my own. My hands no longer trembled. For the first time since the night of the message, I felt clarity sharp as glass. They weren't just cruel, they were foolish. They had tried to erase the one person who had the power to erase them. As I stood to leave, Martin spoke one last time. Eleanor, remember, this isn't just about property or money, it's about dignity. Don't let them confuse the two. I walked out of that office taller than I had walked in. The city hummed below me, indifferent to my war, but inside I was no longer the woman they thought they could exile. I was the owner, the guarantor, the foundation, and now I had the documents to prove it. Driving back toward the mansion, I looked at the skyline and whispered to myself, they wanted to play me like a pawn. But pawns are underestimated until they cross the board. Then they become queens. The storm was no longer distant. It was here, and I was ready to wield it. Charles loved nothing more than the sound of his own voice echoing in places where power gathered. That week he was at the Westwood Business Club, a polished fortress of glass and marble, where men in tailored suits traded stories and status like currency. I wasn't there, but word travels fast in circles that feed on gossip. A friend of Margaret's saw him standing near the fireplace, drink in hand, boasting to a cluster of men about his estate. He waved his hand as if the mansion were a trophy he had personally earned. This property is unmatched, he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. Worth over $20 million, and every inch of it represents our vision of family legacy. Victoria and I built this life together. It's ours, in every sense that matters. They applauded him, clapped him on the back, admired his watch, his tailored jacket. Not one of them knew the truth, that he was living on the foundation of my sacrifices, that without my signature, his so-called empire would vanish overnight. I imagined him smirking, sipping his bourbon, savoring the illusion. At the same time, Victoria was at home feeding a different illusion. On her social media, she posted photo after photo, her children dressed in matching outfits on the grand staircase, her hand clasped in Charles's as they smiled on the balcony, captions dripping with curated perfection. Family only, she wrote beneath one picture, as if the world needed to be reminded that their circle was closed, as if I had never existed. Comments flooded in. Perfect family! Living the dream! So inspiring! Each one was a nail driven deeper into the coffin they were trying to build around me. They were rewriting the story publicly, framing me out of the picture, while feeding their vanity on admiration from strangers. And me? I was alone in the library that night, surrounded by shelves my husband and I had filled over decades. The air was heavy with the scent of leather and paper, the silence broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. I opened a drawer in the old oak desk, the one my husband had used when balancing the accounts for his first business. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. My fingers lingered on the top envelope, his handwriting steady and familiar. I unfolded the paper slowly, my eyes scanning the words I had almost forgotten. Protect what we built, even from those we love too much. I read it twice, 3 times. My throat tightened. He had known, even then, that love could blind us, that family could sometimes turn into the sharpest blade. He hadn't meant for me to guard against our daughter specifically, but the wisdom was clear. Sacrifice does not guarantee loyalty. And protection means knowing when to defend, even when the threat comes from within your own bloodline. The words struck me harder than Charles's arrogance or Victoria's betrayal, because they weren't just advice, they were a charge, a reminder of the role I had been too hesitant to play. I was not a guest in this mansion. I was its guardian, and guardians do not surrender what they have built. I set the letter down, my hand firm now instead of trembling. For the first time, I did not feel sadness. I felt clarity, sharp as steel. Charles could boast in clubs. Victoria could parade her perfect family for the world to see. But all of it rested on my silence. And my silence was ending. I closed the drawer gently, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the garden stretched into darkness, carefully tended hedges and fountains gleaming faintly under the moonlight. They believed this world belonged to them, but I saw it for what it was, a stage set on foundations I had poured. Pressure was building from every side. Their arrogance grew bolder, their dismissal louder, their cruelty more public. But pressure doesn't just crush, it forges, and under it, I was no longer the victim of their betrayal. I was becoming the weapon they would never see coming. I whispered to the empty library, my husband's words still ringing in my ears. Protect what we built, even from those we love too much. And I promised him, and myself, that I would. The moment I left Martin Feldman's office, the decision was already burning inside me. For too long, I had allowed them to believe they were untouchable. Now it was time to remind them whose name carried the weight. The mansion deed was one thing, but their business line of credit, the lifeline of Charles's inflated empire, was another. He had built his confidence on that invisible safety net, never realizing it could be cut with a single stroke of my pen. I walked into the downtown branch of the bank the next morning. The air smelled of polished wood and faint coffee. A young manager, nervous in his crisp suit, led me to a private office when he saw my identification. Within minutes, the documents were in front of me. I read every line, confirming what Martin had told me. Their credit stood on my guarantee alone. My signature gave them breath. My signature could also suffocate them. I lifted the pen, steady this time, and signed the withdrawal order. The ink spread across the page, final and sharp. As I set the pen down, I whispered under my breath, "Let's see how you perform without my stage." The manager looked at me uncertainly, but I offered only a faint smile. "Make sure it processes immediately." He nodded quickly, already typing into his system. By afternoon, the effect had already reached them. Charles had booked a lavish banquet at the Rosewood Hotel, determined to parade his perfect family to potential investors. Crystal chandeliers glimmered above linen-draped tables. Waiters in pressed uniforms moved swiftly, pouring champagne and arranging hors d'oeuvres. He loved these performances, the theater of wealth. Every detail was meant to impress. When the time came to settle the first portion of the bill, tens of thousands for the event deposit, he handed his black card across the counter with a smirk. "Put it on this," he said smoothly, confident as ever. The hostess ran the card through the machine. A small frown crossed her face. She tried again, then again. "I'm sorry, sir," she said cautiously. "It's been declined." Charles's smirk faltered. He laughed, sharp and forced. "Impossible. Run it again." She did. The same red message blinked on the screen. Declined. Whispers rippled among the staff standing nearby. Investors glanced at one another, their polite smiles faltering. Charles's face flushed, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. There's more than enough in that account. Try another terminal." Victoria shifted uncomfortably at his side, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She whispered, "Charles, people are staring." He shot her a look, his jaw tight. Let them stare. This is a mistake, nothing more. But I knew better. It wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of truth. I wasn't in that banquet hall, but I could picture it perfectly. The man who had sneered at me in my own living room was now red-faced before his peers, stripped of his illusion. The staff hesitated, trying the card once more, but the result was the same. Declined. Charles slammed his fist against the counter, his voice sharp enough to make a waiter flinch. "Find your manager. This card works. Do you have any idea who I am?" The manager appeared, bowing his head with professional calm. "I'm afraid, sir, the bank has withdrawn authorization on your line of credit. There's nothing we can do from here." The words were a dagger. Investors exchanged quiet glances, some checking their watches, others pretending to take urgent phone calls. The illusion Charles had so carefully crafted was crumbling in real time, under chandeliers meant to spotlight his glory. Victoria's face paled. She reached for his arm, whispering frantically, "Charles, please, let's just pay another way." He shoved her hand off, humiliated. "This is sabotage. Someone's behind this." His eyes darted around the room, as if betrayal could be hiding in the corners of the banquet hall. I imagined the scene with perfect clarity from the comfort of my library, where I sat in silence, the letter from my husband still lying on the desk. My pulse was calm, my breath even. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't begged, I hadn't raised my hand in anger. All I had done was sign a line and reclaim what was mine. The sound of my phone buzzing on the table pulled me from my thoughts. It was a message from Margaret. "Heard Charles's card was declined at Rosewood. Word is spreading fast." I smiled faintly, the first true smile in weeks. The storm had begun, and it was of my making. Somewhere in that banquet hall, Charles was shouting at staff, trying to regain his footing, while Victoria's perfect smile cracked in front of the same people she had tried so hard to impress online. And the investors, the ones they needed most, were quietly walking away. I whispered to myself, "You thought I was powerless. Now you've felt the first cut." The mansion was still theirs to strut through. The photographs still painted their image of a flawless family. But the money, the credit, the lifeline they depended on, it was gone. And this was only the beginning. The fallout from Charles's humiliation at the Rosewood Hotel didn't stay contained within those glittering walls. It followed him home like a shadow he couldn't shake. By the time I returned to the mansion that evening, his temper had already reached its boiling point. I could hear the muffled rise and fall of voices behind the closed doors of the drawing room. I stood at the foot of the grand staircase, still and quiet, listening. Charles's voice tore through the silence, sharp and merciless. "Did you mess up, Victoria? Tell me the truth. Why is everything frozen? Why are the accounts locked?" His words cut like whips. Victoria's reply came trembling, her tone caught between fear and shame. "I didn't touch anything, Charles. You think I would risk all of this? No, it's her. She's behind this." The pause that followed was heavier than the words themselves. I didn't need to peek inside to imagine the scene. Victoria, pale and shaking, her hands clenched around her phone as though it could shield her. Charles looming over her, fury blazing in his eyes, his jaw set like stone. I turned and walked quietly toward the library, letting their voices trail behind me. The irony was not lost on me. They had banished me from their plans, dismissed me with a single text, yet here they were, blaming each other for the storm I had set in motion. Their argument grew sharper. Charles slammed something, maybe a glass, maybe the arm of a chair. The sound splintered through the house. "Don't stand there and act innocent, Victoria. You were supposed to handle the bills, the transfers, the updates. If you let one thing slip, if you gave her an opening—" "I didn't!" she cried out, the words breaking into sobs. "She's not weak like you think. Don't you see? She's still the one holding the strings. She always has been. We can't just erase her." For a moment, there was silence. Then Charles's voice lowered, dangerous and cold. "If she's behind this, then she's declaring war. And I don't lose wars." Victoria's sobs turned to shaky breaths. "But Charles, what if we already lost? What if she has more than we know?" His answer was a bitter laugh, hollow and unconvincing. "She's an old woman. Without us, she's nothing. Do you understand? Nothing." But even from across the hall, I could hear the doubt beneath his bravado. The cracks were showing, not just in their finances, but in their marriage. The alliance that once made them bold enough to cast me aside was beginning to splinter under pressure. I closed the library door behind me and leaned against the heavy oak panels. Their words echoed in my chest, not as pain this time, but as confirmation. The justice I had been waiting for was not only arriving, it was dismantling them from the inside. Still, I could not allow myself to revel in their unraveling just yet. My husband's letter lay on the desk, his words etched forever in my heart. Protect what we built, even from those we love too much. That line haunted me now. Because love had blinded me once, it would not blind me again. Their fight spilled into the corridor. Charles stormed out, his shoes striking the marble floor with fury. He didn't look at me as he passed. He couldn't. Not when the shame was written across his face for the first time. Victoria trailed behind him, mascara streaked down her cheeks, her once perfect composure in ruins. She glanced at me for a fleeting second, her eyes pleading. But I offered no words, no comfort. Not this time. Let her sit with the reality she had chosen. That night, the mansion was louder than it had ever been. Slamming doors, muffled arguments, footsteps pacing the halls. The perfect family image they so carefully curated for the outside world was collapsing inside these walls, and they could not contain it. I sat by the window, watching the garden lights flicker across the lawn, and thought to myself, this is what fairness feels like. Not revenge, not cruelty, just the weight of consequences settling where they belong. In the silence between their arguments, I could almost hear my husband's voice again. Strong, steady, unwavering. "Don't let them take from you what you bled to build," I whispered back. "I won't. Not anymore." The night stretched long, each hour carrying more tension than the last. By dawn, the cracks between Charles and Victoria were no longer hidden. Their whispers had turned into accusations, their unity into suspicion. And for the first time since the text that shattered my world, I felt no fear. Only resolve, because the storm was no longer coming. It was here, and I was ready. The mansion glittered that evening like a palace in a magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers blazed above silk-draped tables. A quartet played softly in the corner, while servers in white gloves floated past with champagne flutes balanced on silver trays. Guests arrived in waves, businessmen in tailored suits, their wives dripping with diamonds, photographers snapping every detail. This was Charles and Victoria's stage, their attempt to silence the whispers that had spread since his card was declined at the Rosewood Hotel. Tonight they would reclaim their narrative. Tonight they would prove to the world that they were still the perfect couple in control of everything. I watched from the balcony above, unseen for the moment. Below me, Charles strode across the marble floor, his smile sharp and rehearsed. He clasped hands, offered hollow laughs, nodded as though he were royalty greeting subjects. Victoria followed, radiant in her sequined gown, her social media smile plastered across her face, though her eyes betrayed unease. Together, they looked like a painting of wealth and power, until you looked close enough to see the cracks. Charles clinked his glass sharply, commanding silence. The music died. Conversations hushed. Cameras lifted. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the declaration he believed would restore his empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming with false confidence, "tonight is not just a celebration of our life, our success, our family. It is also the moment we proudly announce full ownership of this estate, this mansion, this empire. It belongs to us now." Applause erupted on cue, though it carried the polite stiffness of obligation. Victoria's smile widened painfully, her hand trembling as she slipped it into his. Then the double doors at the far end of the hall opened. My attorney, Martin Feldman, walked in with calm authority, his leather briefcase in hand. Every head turned. The echo of his footsteps filled the silence as he approached the podium where Charles stood. Charles's smile faltered. "Martin, what are you doing here?" Martin didn't answer him. Instead, he opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick folder stamped with the seal of the county court, and addressed the room in a steady, commanding tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the grand hall. "As counsel to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, I have been asked to clarify certain misconceptions regarding the ownership of this estate." The crowd shifted, whispers rising. Cameras swung toward me as I descended the staircase slowly, each step deliberate, my head held high. Martin continued, "Under the Hayes Family Trust, executed and notarized, Eleanor Hayes remains the sole legal owner of this mansion and its grounds. Charles Whitmore and Victoria Whitmore have no ownership rights. They are authorized residents only, contingent on Eleanor Hayes's continued consent." The words detonated in the room like thunder. The applause from moments earlier dissolved into gasps. Photographers surged forward, flashes exploding like lightning. Guests exchanged startled looks, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Charles's face drained of color, his practiced confidence crumbling in an instant. That's absurd," he barked. "Everyone knows this house is mine. We've poured everything into it." Martin didn't flinch. He held up the signed documents. "The law does not recognize vanity as ownership, Mr. Whitmore. Only deeds, and the deed rests with Mrs. Hayes." All eyes turned to me as I reached the base of the staircase. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My words were sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You declared this house was yours, but you forgot whose hands built the fortune that bought it. You forgot whose name is written in ink, not in fantasies." Victoria stepped forward, her smile trembling, her voice dripping with desperate charm. "Mother, please, this isn't necessary. We're family. Why humiliate us like this?" I met her gaze, unblinking. Family doesn't erase the one who gave them everything. Family doesn't plan to sell the house and send me to a facility. You made your choice. Now face the truth in front of the same people you tried so hard to impress. The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests looked at Charles and Victoria, not with admiration, but with pity and disgust. The mask of their perfect life had shattered. Charles tried to rally, his voice hoarse with rage. "This is a trick, a pathetic attempt to steal my dignity. Don't listen to them." But the guests no longer believed him. Their eyes told the story. The empire he tried to project had just collapsed in a single moment, and everyone had witnessed it. Victoria's composure broke. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, almost to herself, "She's behind everything." The cameras caught it, every flash immortalizing her defeat. I stood taller, calm amidst the chaos. The truth doesn't need applause, it stands on its own. The quartet began to play again, awkwardly trying to fill the silence, but the atmosphere had already shifted. Conversations buzzed, speculation spread like wildfire, and Charles's reputation, once untouchable, lay in ruins at his own party. I turned to leave, the flashes following me. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Justice had already spoken louder than I ever could. Behind me, Charles and Victoria stood frozen, their empire of illusions crumbling under the weight of one undeniable fact. The mansion was mine, and so was the power they thought I had lost. The days following the disastrous gala unfolded like dominoes collapsing in slow motion. One by one, Charles's allies began to disappear. The same men who had shaken his hand beneath the chandeliers now avoided his calls. The phone in his study rang less and less until silence filled the house where his arrogance had once echoed. At breakfast, I sat in the corner of the grand dining room, quiet, sipping tea. Across from me, Charles slammed his phone onto the table, his face red with fury. "They pulled out!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Every single one of them. Contracts canceled. Deals gone. They're treating me like a fraud." Victoria's eyes were swollen from crying. She twisted her napkin in trembling hands. "Charles, maybe if we explain, Maybe if we tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Explain, he snapped, leaning close, his finger stabbing the air. Do you think anyone cares about explanations? All they saw was me humiliated in my own house, and they saw her. He jerked his head toward me, holding all the cards. No one invests in a man who doesn't even own the roof over his head. His words should have stung. Once they might have. But now they slid past me like water against stone. I set my cup down gently and said, calm as ever, "No, Charles. No one invests in a man who builds his life on lies." His chair screeched back as he stood, towering over me. Rage burned in his eyes, the kind of rage born from desperation. "You did this. You destroyed me. You destroyed this family." Victoria's sobs filled the silence. She buried her face in her hands, whispering, "She's right, Charles. We pushed too far," but Charles wasn't listening. Charles. He pounded his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. Everything was perfect until she meddled, until she couldn't let go. I rose slowly, steady in the face of his fury. My voice carried no anger, only the weight of truth. "No, you destroyed it the moment you erased your own mother. You thought family was an accessory you could discard. That arrogance is what ended you, not me." The room fell into a stunned silence. Victoria's tears slowed, her shoulders sagging beneath the truth she could no longer deny. Charles stood trembling, his hands clenched, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew I was right. Later that week, the first creditors arrived. Letters stamped with red ink piled high on their desk. Overdue balances, foreclosures looming, demands for repayment. Charles's empire, propped up on my signature, was crumbling faster than he could react. I watched from a distance, never raising my voice, never gloating. Justice didn't need spectacle. It unfolded quietly, relentlessly, undeniable as gravity. Victoria tried to call me one evening. She came to my study door, her face pale, her hands shaking. "Mother, please, can't we find a way through this? The children, think of them." I closed the ledger I was reviewing and looked at her, my expression unreadable. "I did think of them. I thought of them when I built this fortune, when I bought this house, when I signed every paper to secure their future. But you chose to cast me out. You chose vanity over love. And now you live with that choice." Her lips parted, as if to argue, but no words came. She turned away, tears running down her cheeks. That night, Charles exploded again, his voice shaking the mansion walls. I heard him from the hallway. "We'll rebuild. I'll find new partners. I'll make them regret leaving me." But his words rang hollow, empty threats shouted into the void. The truth was already written. Their world was collapsing, not because I had struck, but because I had stopped holding it up. I sat by the fire, my husband's letter in my lap, the flames reflecting in my eyes. "Protect what we built," he had written. And that was exactly what I had done. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not the fragile peace of appeasement, but the solid peace of justice finally restored. Their downfall wasn't cruel. It was fair. And for everyone who had ever been erased by the ones they loved most, it was vindication. The empire they flaunted had fallen. All that remained was truth. And truth, no matter how painful, never loses. The air inside the mansion shifted the day I made the announcement. No glittering chandeliers, no cameras flashing, no hollow applause. Just a press conference in the Grand Hall, the same space where Charles and Victoria had once tried to crown themselves king and queen of a false empire. Rows of chairs filled with journalists, community leaders, and a handful of women who knew me not as an accessory, but as one of their own. Charles and Victoria stood off to the side, pale and tense. They had no control left, but they couldn't resist watching, hoping for some desperate opening. Their eyes burned holes into me, but I didn't flinch. I walked to the podium with my attorney by my side and unfolded the papers I had been preparing for months. The room hushed. Cameras clicked. My voice carried steady and sharp. For years, this house has been a symbol of arrogance, a playground for vanity. But it was never meant for that. My husband and I built this fortune not for greed, but for legacy. And today, I am taking it back to where it belongs. A ripple moved through the audience. I let it settle before delivering the blow. Effective immediately, this mansion will no longer be the residence of the Whitmores. It will be transformed into the Heritage Foundation for Forgotten Women, a sanctuary and a platform for women who were silenced, overlooked, or discarded by the very families they gave everything to. Gasps filled the hall. Reporters leaned forward, pens flying across notepads. Cameras flashed faster. Behind me, I heard Victoria's faint gasp, a small choke of disbelief. Charles muttered under his breath, "No, this isn't happening. Not this house." I continued, my tone unshaken. "The trust has been amended, the endowment secured. This estate, worth $22 million, is now untouchable by those who sought only to exploit it. Its doors will open not for those who erased their own, but for women who deserve to be seen." The applause began softly, hesitant, then swelled into a wave that echoed against the marble walls. Some of the women in the front row, widows, caretakers, mothers estranged from ungrateful children, were already in tears. For them, this wasn't just news. It was vindication. I turned, my eyes locking with Victoria's. She looked like she'd been struck, her perfect posture sagging under the weight of truth. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You planned this? All along?" "Yes," I answered calmly. "While you were polishing your image for strangers, I was safeguarding a future for those who had none. Every time you tried to erase me, I built another wall of protection around what mattered." Charles lurched forward, his face twisted with rage. "You're insane! You think you can just strip this house from us? You think people will applaud you for throwing away everything we built?" I faced him, unblinking. "You built nothing, Charles. You lived off what was never yours. And now, for the first time, the world sees the truth. This house was never your throne. It was my gift, and you lost it when you chose arrogance over gratitude." The crowd erupted again, questions flying, recorders shoved closer. Charles tried to shout over them, but his voice was drowned out. His empire had evaporated, his dignity had followed. Victoria collapsed into a chair, her sequined dress glittering under the harsh lights, now nothing more than armor that no longer fit. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "It's all gone." I leaned closer, my words meant for her alone. "No, Victoria, it isn't all gone. You still have a chance to remember what family is supposed to mean. But as long as you measure it in possessions, you'll always end up empty." Her eyes widened, torn between shame and the faint spark of understanding. But Charles only seethed, his pride too thick to let in the truth. As the conference closed, I stepped away from the podium. Reporters swarmed the attorney for details. Guests crowded around, offering handshakes and thanks. But I kept walking, my stride steady, the echo of my heels ringing through the hall. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like a burden. I didn't feel erased. I felt whole. The mansion, once a cage of cruelty, was now a beacon, and the people who had tried to erase me were left standing in the ruins of their own hubris. That was the twist I had been waiting for. Not revenge, but reclamation. Not bitterness, but clarity. The story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. The morning after the press conference, the air inside the mansion felt different. Not the usual heavy silence of resentment, but something sharper, more final. I had waited long enough. Their tantrums, their arrogance, their endless denial. It all ended now. I called them into the drawing room, the same place where Charles once dared to declare the mansion his. I stood by the fireplace, the documents already prepared on the mahogany table. My attorney sat nearby, silent but firm, his presence sealing the legitimacy of what was about to happen. Charles stormed in first, his face twisted with fury, Victoria trailing behind him with swollen eyes and shoulders slumped beneath the weight of defeat. They looked nothing like the golden couple who had once strutted through these halls. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You have 1 month," I said evenly, my eyes fixed on theirs. 30 days to remove yourselves from this house. After that, your residency privileges under the trust are terminated." Victoria froze, her lips parting as though she couldn't quite process the words. Charles barked out a bitter laugh, slamming his palm against the table so hard the glasses rattled. "You can't just throw us out like dogs. This is our home." I met his rage with calm steel. "It was never your home, Charles. It was a gift you mistook for ownership. That mistake ends now." Victoria's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her hands clasped together. "Mother, please. The children. Where will we go? How can you do this?" Tears brimmed, spilling freely down her cheeks. "We're family." The words should have softened me once, but they rang hollow now, brittle excuses too late to matter. I answered coldly, "Family doesn't exile the woman who built the foundation of their lives. You had a chance to honor that bond, and you chose to erase it. You erased me. Now you live with that choice." Charles's fists clenched, his knuckles white. He turned on Victoria, snarling, "This is your fault. You let her corner us. You stood there while she humiliated us." She shook her head violently, sobbing. "No, Charles, don't you dare blame me. You pushed for this. You told me we had to cut her out, that she'd ruin our image. And now look where we are." Their argument spiraled, their voices crashing against each other like waves in a storm. I watched in silence, the two of them devouring themselves with blame. It was poetic justice, the unity they once flaunted disintegrating before my eyes. When their shouting finally burned itself out, I spoke again, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. 30 days. That's all you have. I suggest you use the time wisely." Victoria broke first. She sank onto the couch, tears staining her dress, her body trembling as though the weight of reality had finally crushed her. "We have nothing left," she whispered, almost to herself. "No business, no friends, no house," Charles roared, slamming his fist again. "We'll rebuild. We'll find another way. She can't win forever." But his voice cracked at the edges, the defiance already fading. Even he knew the truth. His empire wasn't crumbling. It was already gone. Later that afternoon, I walked past Victoria's room. The door was half open. Inside, she was folding clothes into suitcases, her sobs muffled against the quiet shuffle of fabric. Photographs lay scattered on the bed, smiling family portraits, vacation snapshots, images meant to tell a story of perfection. She slipped one into her bag with trembling hands, but the illusion was gone. Charles, meanwhile, paced the study like a caged animal. I heard the sharp crash of glass as he swept books and frames off the desk. "She thinks she's won," he growled to himself. "She thinks she can erase me." His rage was a hollow echo now, powerless without the wealth he had stolen through my name. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of release. Not joy, not triumph, something quieter, steadier, justice. They had written me out of their lives, and now they were the ones being written out of mine. That night I stood in the hallway, the mansion lights dimmed. I thought of my husband, of the promise I had kept. Protect what we built, even from those we love too much. I whispered into the stillness, "I did it, James. I kept what was ours." In the distance, I heard a suitcase zipper close, followed by the sound of Victoria's sobs echoing through the corridor. Somewhere else in the house, Charles cursed into the night, his voice hoarse and broken. The balance had shifted. The guilty had been exposed. And though they remained under my roof for 30 more days, they were already gone. For the first time in a long time, the house belonged to me again. The day Charles and Victoria began packing their last boxes, I knew the mansion needed new life. Empty halls carry ghosts. They echo with bitterness if you let them. But I refused to let this house stay chained to betrayal. It had been bought with sacrifice. It had witnessed cruelty. And now it would become something better. I called Margaret Doyle first. She had been my anchor through the storm, the one voice that reminded me I was more than the sum of their ingratitude. When I asked her to join me at the mansion, she didn't hesitate. "Tell me when," she said, her voice steady, "and I'll bring the others." The next Sunday afternoon, the gates opened not to self-important businessmen or hollow charity galas, but to women who had been forgotten, women like me. widows who had given everything to children who now ignored them, single mothers still working double shifts in their 60s, neighbors whose voices had been drowned out by louder, younger ambitions. They came hesitantly at first, clutching coats and handbags, unsure if they truly belonged. But the moment they stepped into the great hall, I felt the energy shift. Margaret clasped my hand tightly and whispered, "You've turned a battlefield into a sanctuary." We gathered in the dining room, the same long mahogany table where Charles once pounded his fist and Victoria once staged her perfect family photographs. Now that table bore homemade pies, casseroles, fresh bread, dishes each woman had brought with pride. The air filled with warmth, not the sterile polish of catered events, but the honest smell of shared meals. I sat at the head of the table, not as a ruler, but as a host. Margaret raised her glass first. "To Eleanor," she said, her eyes glistening, "for reminding us that family isn't who takes from you, but who sees you." The women echoed, voices overlapping, laughter breaking through the solemnity. Some wiped away tears, others leaned on each other. For the first time in years, I felt something pure in these walls, belonging. As the evening unfolded, stories spilled across the table like wine. One woman, Helen, shared how her son hadn't visited in 5 years, though she had raised him alone after her husband died. Another, Rosa, confessed that her daughter only called when she needed money. Each tale struck a chord inside me, each echoing my own wounds. Yet as they spoke, I realized none of us were victims anymore. We were witnesses for each other, proof that love and respect could be rebuilt, even if not from our children. At one point, Margaret leaned closer and whispered, "Do you hear it?" I tilted my head. The house, once so suffocating, now rang with laughter, the kind that rises from deep in the belly, unafraid and unashamed. I looked down the table at the faces glowing under the chandelier's soft light, wrinkles etched by time, eyes brightened by resilience. This mansion, once the stage for my humiliation, was alive again, not with vanity or pretense, but with truth. Later that night, when dessert plates were cleared and the fire crackled in the hearth, I stood to speak. My voice did not tremble. This house was once used to exclude me, to erase me, but it belongs not to arrogance or greed. It belongs to those who understand its true value, community, dignity, and legacy. Tonight, you are my family, and this table will always have a place for you. Applause rose, gentle at first, then stronger, not the hollow clapping of society galas, but the genuine affirmation of women who knew pain, who knew survival, and who now knew they weren't alone. Margaret wiped her eyes, laughing through her tears. "You did it, Eleanor. You broke the cycle." I smiled, a warmth spreading through me that no betrayal could touch. For so long, I had been consumed by the sting of rejection, by the ache of being cast aside. But watching these women embrace each other, hearing their voices weave together in solidarity, I understood the deeper truth. I hadn't lost a family. I had gained one. That night, as the last guests left and the mansion grew quiet again, I walked the hallways alone. But it wasn't the same silence as before. No shadows loomed. The walls no longer carried echoes of insults or greed. Instead, they seemed to hum with promise. I paused at the front door, looking back into the house bathed in soft lamplight. My husband's words came back to me. Protect what we built, even from those we love too much. I had done more than protect it. I had transformed it. Tomorrow, the papers would be filed to finalize the Heritage Foundation for Forgotten Women. But tonight, I allowed myself to savor the beginning. The mansion was no longer a prison. It was a home again. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. I stood on the lawn of the mansion, the same ground where betrayal once pierced me like a blade. Tonight, it was different. Tonight, the air carried laughter, not tension. Hope, not hostility. I inhaled deeply, steady, and whispered to myself, I didn't lose a family. I found the right one. Behind me, the tall windows of the mansion glowed with soft light. Inside, Margaret and the other women prepared candles, placing them carefully along the dining table, the staircase, the wide hall that had once echoed with cruel words. Their hands moved gently, reverently. When each flame caught, the shadows shrank, and warmth spread through the house like a heartbeat returning after silence. I watched them gather. Women scarred by neglect, women who had been silenced, dismissed, replaced. Yet here they stood, together, shoulders touching, their voices weaving into a single sound, gentle laughter mixed with quiet strength. Margaret came outside, carrying one of the candles. She pressed it into my hand. "You lit the first fire, Eleanor. We'll keep it burning." I looked at her, at the lines of resilience etched across her face. For so long, people like us were told our worth expired once we grew older, once our children decided we were no longer useful. Tonight proved them wrong. We stood side by side as the others joined us, each woman holding her candle. The mansion behind us shimmered with their light, glowing like a beacon. We walked onto the lawn together and placed the candles in a wide circle, their flames dancing in the evening breeze. I lifted mine last, setting it in the center. The circle blazed brighter, not with luxury or wealth, but with something far greater: dignity. Charles and Victoria's absence no longer haunted me. Their shadows had dissolved into the night, their bitterness irrelevant. What mattered now was what we had built, an unbreakable truth that family isn't defined by blood, but by respect, by loyalty, by love that endures when storms come. The women joined hands, their faces lit by candlelight. Some whispered prayers, others simply closed their eyes and breathed. The circle felt holy, not in ritual, but in its raw humanity. I spoke, my voice cutting through the silence, strong and clear. They tried to erase me. They tried to erase all of us in their own ways. But here we stand, not erased, not forgotten. We are still here, and we are enough. Applause rose, not loud, but steady, affirming. Margaret squeezed my hand, her eyes wet but unbroken. Helen nodded, whispering, "Yes, we are." I looked around at these women, at this mansion reborn, and I knew this was justice. Not revenge, not destruction. Justice. The night closed in, stars pricking the sky, the circle of candles casting a glow that reached far beyond the lawn. I imagined neighbors looking on, wondering what had changed in this house once known for arrogance and scandal. Let them wonder. Soon they would see. This was no longer a battlefield. It was a sanctuary, a place for healing, for legacy, for voices long silenced to rise again. As I turned back toward the mansion, I felt no bitterness, no anger, only clarity. Blood may betray you, wealth may blind you, but true family, the kind forged in respect and care, never fades. That night, as the candles flickered and the women's laughter echoed into the dark, I closed my eyes and repeated the truth aloud, for myself, for them, and for anyone who would listen. Family is not bound by blood. Family is bound by love. The flames carried my words upward into the night, leaving behind not the weight of betrayal, but the gift of renewal.